Hi, this is Catherine, and this is Taking Tea with Catherine. And this is the first installment of Tea and History. I've been trying to get to this for some time now, and here we are. This is Victorian chai that I had from a tea shop, or a spice and tea shop in San Antonio that I've had for a while, so I really must keep drinking it, and I do like it quite a lot. It's closer to genuine chai than a lot of the mixes that you'll have, but not exactly genuine. I like it though, so. And I picked a thing that said Victorian because I will talk about Victorian things a little bit. I'm going from the time of Alfred the Great to the Victorian times, Queen Victoria, so that's about a span of 1,000 years between them. But yes, it's very different, but in my personal history, it has something in common in that it has renewed my interest in something. So let's back up. I'm not going to just talk about the two books that I've read that are history books today. I'm also going to start this, because it's the beginning of the series, talking about my history with history, my personal history. And I'm not talking about history in school, because I didn't really enjoy it that much. Not that I hated every minute of it, but it really didn't make me interested in sitting down or reading history books for pleasure. And that's the main thing for me. It's why have I been reading history just for fun? I mean, literally fun. I think this is fun when I sit down and read a history book. A lot of people wouldn't be caught dead reading history books, because why would you do that? For what purpose? So, what got me into it? Well, I wasn't always that into history. Excuse me. My voice gurgled a little bit. We need more tea. I wasn't that always into history, but history wasn't always that into me. I was always a reader for the most part, but most of the books that I read, occasional nonfiction. If I was interested in a subject, I would read more about it. But I read a lot of novels, and when I started reading novels of a more mature, when I say mature, not like, mature audiences, but like, less children's bookish, I started reading a lot of classics. So, of course, that made me a little bit interested in history, because it was written during a time period that I didn't know much about. So you want to know the background, but I didn't read that much about it nevertheless. Like when I was reading Les Miserables, there was a lot of references to different wars, etc., that I had no idea about, and even now I don't know that much about, and could do with more reading. So it wasn't that I was ignorant, but I wasn't as non-ignorant about history, if that makes sense. But I did like tea a lot, and so since I like tea, I read a lot about the history of tea, just because almost every book written about tea would include that in the introduction or onwards. And so I learned a little bit about the Chinese dynasties, and Japan, and India, and of course European history, American history factored in, a lot of British history factored in there. Not always good, but yeah, some things just not very, encouraging of. Even if it did bring us tea in the long run, it's just like, oh, at what cost? But it was interesting, but I still wouldn't call myself a history person, like that into reading a history. It wasn't the thing, like I wouldn't go into a bookshop or a library and say, let's go to the history section yet. And then I went through a little bit of a reading slump, and it took me a while to figure out exactly when it ended, because I don't think I ever stopped reading entirely. I just stopped reading a lot. So I would read a few books a year rather than at least a few books a month, at least. And that was okay, because sometimes, there's certain times in your life that you just do different things. But in 1999, I went to England again, and I didn't do a lot of book shopping or library looking or even museum visiting. It was very much not that kind of trip. It was very much more social. And I still enjoyed it. I remember I was in Dorset for a little while, and there were these, we stayed with a family, actually. My friends and I stayed with a family there in a cottage in Dorset. I didn't appreciate it as much as I would now. Ugh. I was a little curious because I knew about Thomas Hardy, and so there was some stuff. But I was watching an old video one time. I haven't watched it in a while, but I remember after getting into history, there's a part where we were driving around, and I was filming outside. I think we were near Corfe Castle. And one of the girls, they were driving us around, very nice of them. And they were talking about the Normans and the Saxons. And I just, at the time, I barely responded. I probably just went, uh-huh, because I just knew nothing about them. I've heard of them because, I mean, I'd heard of the Normans. I didn't know how I knew about the Normans. But the Saxons I knew because my grandmother on my dad's side one day sat with us and said, "You're Anglo-Saxon," which I'm not sure how Anglo-Saxon I am because our family mostly on that side originated from the north of England, which probably would have been somewhat Viking too. So I don't know where that came from, but you know, people have their stuff, have their things. But that was it. And then while we were there, though, we had watched a movie about Queen Elizabeth. You know, the one with Kate Blanchett. Going back, it's not the most historically accurate. It's kind of like the other Boleyn Girl, where it's interesting but embellished and times a little bit mixed up. But you enjoy it just for the fun of it. And, you know, it wasn't the first movie I'd seen about British royalty. I'd seen that movie, Mrs. Brown, I think it was called, with the widowed Queen Victoria. So, like, I knew a little bit, but not a lot. And there was just so much more to know. I was remotely curious after seeing Elizabeth, but not, like, dying. But when I was in the airport in Gatwick going home from that trip, there was, I guess, a little bookshop. Maybe it was Waterstones, I don't know. And they had the Lives of the Kings and Queens of England edited by Antonia Fraser. So when I saw the Queen Elizabeth here, and I picked it up, and I thought this could be good reading anyway, if I run out of things on the plane to do or something. And I think I started like reading a little bit of it on the plane, and that was it. Didn't think much more of it. So a little while later, I started working again in the city, in Manhattan, because I'd been between jobs and temping here and there. But I finally got a permanent job, and it was right around the corner from the Mid-Manhattan Library, which is a big library. It's not the main one on 42nd Street, which has the library, Lions, Patience, and Fortitude, I think. And I hope I'm right because I want to pride myself on knowing these things. But it was really close, and the library was like around the corner from my job. So I had noticed someone at work having taken a lot of books out from there, and I said, I think I already had a library card from there previously from when I was in school and needed to do research. I don't know. So I decided to pay him a visit, and I would, you know, look at novels and stuff. You know, there were a lot of interesting things coming out around 99. But at one point I found myself in the fiction section under P, and I found a book by Jean Plady called The Captive of Kensington Palace. Now, I see Kensington Palace, I pick up a book, because the very first place we went to in London when we settled into the place we were staying in 1994, my sister and I, was Kensington, and we found ourselves taking pictures in front of Kensington Palace. And I've always liked Kensington because that's where Freddie Mercury lived also, you know. And yeah, and that was a little bit of history too. I read a little bit about, you know, England in the 60s and 70s just from being into Queen and the Beatles and British rock and a lot of stuff, but very little. And so of course I took it out. It was about the childhood of Queen Victoria, and under, you know, her mom and the whole strict upbringing between, what's his name, Sir John Conroy, I think it was, blanking right now, even though I've just recently watched the Victoria series again. But yeah, so it was just enough to get me wanting to read more of at least Jean Plady's books. And shortly after that, I started reading, I think it was a book about Henry II and his sons and Eleanor of Aquitaine, who became one of my favorite queens to read about. And that got me interested in that time period and the Crusades. And I just kept reading different books about, that by Jean Plady. Since then, I've gotten into other historical novelists who I think are even better. But at the time, this was good. This was a really good start. And I would pair it up, I guess, with the lives of the kings and queens of England. So this helped me to supplement, that's the word, supplement, my knowledge and the time periods. And it got to the point where I memorized the entire line of kings and queens from the Norman Conquest to now. But most of my reading took place between the Norman Conquest of 1066 and Victorian times. After that, not that much. In recent years, I've gotten more interested in the time after the Victorians, and I read a little bit. I mean, I've read other parts of history too, but that's what I mean. It After reading about that, I started wanting to read. When I'd read about a different time period in Jean Plady's writings, I'd want to read more about that. So I usually get biographies out, but other history books, and so that just snowballed into me reading a lot of history. And I read a lot of books about the Tudor time period, who hasn't? But even medieval times, the Plantagenet time periods, every time period, the Georgian time period, and because Jean Plady had a book for all of that, and then some other time periods too, because Jean Plady wrote about other European kings and queens too, Isabella of Castile, the Borgias, Catherine de Medici, some of the other, I think it was like Louis XIV, maybe at some point. So I'd read the historical fiction version of it, and then I would start taking out or buying books about that time period or about certain people. So then I became into a person who was really interested in history, but I didn't read that much about the Anglo-Saxon time period. I remember reading Queen Emma and the Vikings, which was the shortly, when I say shortly, not like within the same, I guess, century of the Norman conquest, but beforehand, when there was more involvement with the Danish coming down, Canute and all those kind of people, Edward the Confessor, that whole time period and what it encompassed. So I knew a little bit. I'd look things up here and there. And I saw a show about monarchy, called Monarchy. I think it was David Starkey, one of these historian people. And he did talk a little bit. He started from the Anglo-Saxon time period, really. And so I became more and more curious about Alfred the Great, because they made him seem interesting, but they didn't go too much into his upbringing, etc. And neither does this book, but this is the first book I'm going to talk about, which is The White Horse King, The Life of Alfred the Great by Benjamin Merkel. So this is a good, I would say, a good gateway into Anglo-Saxon history, especially this time period when they were really struggling to fight off the Vikings. And he was successful in ways that a lot of other kings of his time were not. And I liked reading about him very much. I'm not saying he was a perfect person. I'm sure there were flaws that I don't know about. But he did his best, and he wasn't like this power-hungry king, even though he did assemble power in some ways and stuff. But he was progressive, and he didn't seem to have as many family troubles. I'm not saying he had none, but his next older brother, when he was the king, had to fight off the Vikings, and Alfred supported him, fought with him, and they trusted each other. And it made me worry, because I was thinking about Edward IV and Richard III and how they worked together so well, but then after Edward IV died, it was like, oh my goodness. But it wasn't like that. When Alfred became the king, it was just like the natural progression, the natural succession, and at least it seemed to be that way. And he managed to fight off, even though there were struggles, he managed to fight off the Viking invasions, and the raids, or whatever you call it. And he had difficulty of it too, because it was one time the Vikings took advantage of the Christian Anglo-Saxons celebrating their Christian holidays. And the this one Viking just decided to attack during one of these celebrations, so they were all taken aback, and so Alfred had to kind of hide out for a while and regroup. And then he was, later on, obviously, spoiler alert, he was successful in taking over again. And it's funny how he just didn't just destroy his enemies, he actually had them convert to Christianity, and he became the Godfather. And it's like, well, that's pretty forgiving, but it kind of put me in mind a little bit of King David, because that not exactly wasn't as King David had a lot more family issues, but in the terms of his being king and having to be in exile for a while and then coming back, and the fact that King David was relatively a merciful king as well. So that was kind of interesting. And also Alfred was very much a fan, as it were, of the Psalms, so he might have felt a connection himself. But that's another thing that made me interested in him is he wasn't just this random medieval king who just ruled, threw his power around and, whatever. But he realized that the Vikings were not just going to give up. So he set up guards and everything all over his kingdom, Wessex, and then I guess it stretched into the rest of England after a while. And it just, like, the Vikings had a much more difficult time in being able to fight off the Saxons then. And so, or the Anglo-Saxons, it's just easier to say the Saxons. And I like that. I mean, part of the reading wasn't as interesting. I'm not very interested in reading about battles, and there was a lot about the shield walls, which is basically them fighting all around each other and shielding each other. And all I picture is a bunch of people literally fighting like this the whole time. It looked like one big turtle to me. But, so that wasn't the most interesting, but it was necessary. And so when he was able to establish all of this, he was also able to kind of consolidate and have a more organized system and a more modernized, really, system of rulership and culture even. He was very interested in people being able to read. Not all of his higher-ups were that interested in that himself, but he was, and not just Latin, but English, as it was back then, the Old English. He wanted the Bible translated into English, which in future centuries was a very radical notion. So he was ahead of his time in so many ways, and he was a fair king, and I also related to him in a lot of ways because, not that I was at all able to fight in my lifetime, but he seemed to have certain health issues that were of a digestive nature. And I mean, he died around 50, so I mean, in those days that wasn't so bad. But I found him relatable because of that. I felt like there was more to it than met the eye, and I looked it up a little bit, and they said he might have had Crohn's disease. So yeah, I mean, what a horrible thing to live with in those times. It's hard enough to live with now, but oh my goodness. So I really loved this book. I even laughed a couple of times because they were talking about Nottingham, and this little footnote talks about, at that time, more than 3 centuries before the time of Robin Hood, the Anglo-Saxon name of Nottingham was Snottingham. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Apparently named after an earlier chieftain named Snot. Luckily for the modern-day residents of the city, the S was eventually dropped from the name, and so rather than Snottingham, the city is now called Nottingham. Imagine that. And there's just, little things. I put stickers in, and I'm not remembering everything. But Danegeld I found very interesting. The whole paying off the Danish. Sometimes it worked, to keep them away, and sometimes it encouraged them to come back. 'Cause it's like, oh, you got riches? I want the riches. So I really like this book, and now I want to read more. I've seen Jennifer Brooks talk a lot about the Saxon time period, Anglo-Saxon time period, and she's recommended a number of books. I will like to get a hold of them and read some more. And I'd like to read more about the Vikings while I'm at it. So that's another opening for me to vast volumes of history. So the next book that I'm going to talk about is going back to my roots, and it is How to Be Victorian, A Dawn to Dusk Guide to Victorian Life by Ruth Goodman. This is not just a history book, because I mean it is. It's history, not so much of this person ruled from this time period, and this war happened. It wasn't like that, but more of a social history, and really a history that we neglect sometimes. What was life like day to day? I read certain things, medieval times and Tudor times, but not this comprehensive. This book goes into, from the moment you wake up, at whatever time you woke up, a lot of them quite early, and to the moment you went to bed, and whatever activity you did at that point as well. I mean, everything. So, and all the classes too. So it was like, how did one clean oneself in the morning and in the evening? How did one take care of their children? What did one wear? And what did they wear in different time periods? For different jobs. What kind of jobs did people have? What was school like back then? What was the leisure time like? Which, there wasn't that much of, but there was some. The only thing that I felt was not covered enough, and this was me being selfish because I'm a book nerd, but I didn't think they spoke enough about reading. And I know not everyone did read in Victorian times, but there were Here's the thing. There's tons of Victorian novels. We know that. I did Victober. you know, she talks about Anthony Trollope a bit in here. She talks about Dickens, she talks about Gaskell, she talks about George Eliot. So obviously novels are mentioned, but people had to have been reading them, and there wasn't that much talk about people reading for pleasure. And I would have liked a little more of that, but I guess they can't cover every minute of one's day. They cover healthcare and what people would do, which some of it was quite scary. Yeah, different kinds of jobs, the food, what did people eat, and when did they eat? How was it prepared? How did it change over the years? Everything. Like, everything you can imagine. Almost like minutia, and not to mention bathroom habits, which, oh my goodness, I don't know. But it was, how did people travel? How did people get around to their jobs and elsewhere? Did people take vacations? And how did that work out, What happened at the beach, I loved it, and I think it's not just a book for history lovers, because obviously, if you like history, this is going to be interesting, probably, to you. It took me a while to read, but it was still very interesting. But anyone who likes reading Victorian novels or watching Victorian dramas, based on a lot of these novels usually, I think should read this book. And I'll tell you why. It's because now you can really understand, and it's not just Victorian times that a lot of this stuff happened. Some of it was previous too. I mean, if you're going to read Jane Austen, you could probably read a bit about these day-to-day things in the early parts of Victorian times, because it didn't start changing until things went on. But yeah, I mean, like, we see things on the television or in the films, and everybody's all dressed a certain way, and you see them doing things, but you don't really realize what went behind it. And that's why I did like the idea of Longbourn, which is a book by, I think, Joe Baker, and it was the Pride and Prejudice from the servant's point of view, and you realize how much goes into someone's life. Now we have such a different life mainly because of technology, because we have machines to do so much of the things that took them ages to do. We have plumbing, etc., different social things, different clothes, So I would totally recommend both of these books, because this book, I think, would have a wide interest just in so many people who are interested in Victorian times. But this just because Alfred was a very interesting and ahead of his time king, and a much more pleasant person to read about than a lot of kings, to be honest. Unless maybe they just didn't talk a lot about his personal life back then, so it didn't matter. So maybe there were a lot of things he did that weren't so great, but I totally like this. Totally. I hear myself saying totally a lot. Oh my goodness. But also because if you want to read something about history, but you don't want to commit to a massive tome, this is really short. This volume is like less than 250 pages, so not a big commitment. So that has been the very first and probably one of the longer TN histories, because I had to go into my history. I may sometimes talk a little bit about my reading history in subsequent videos, but this one I had to be a little more, thorough. So I hope you've enjoyed, and if you like any of these books, if you want to read them, if you read them already, you want to talk about them, please comment down below. If you want to hear more about tea and history, please subscribe. And if you've read any other books about these time periods that you think are fantastic and that, I really need to get to next, by all means, leave a comment down below. This has been Catherine from Taking Tea with Catherine, Tea and History #1. Have a lovely tea, book, history-filled day. Goodbye.